The phone rang on a Thursday morning in the second week of November. Elaine Hargrove had been awake since 4:30, not because anything was wrong, but because 41 years of sleeping beside a farmer had trained her body to register the dark hours before dawn as time. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, looking out at the yard, at the frost on the grass, at the shape of the barn in the early light, the way you look at things when you're trying to decide whether you're still a person who lives in a place or whether you're now just someone staying in it. Ray had been gone 23 days. The phone rang and she answered it. The man on the other end introduced himself as the agricultural loan officer at First Heritage Bank in Fort Smith. His voice was practiced and careful, the voice of a man who made calls like this regularly and had learned exactly how much softness to load into each word without crossing into something that might read as weakness. He offered his condolences. He said he was sorry to be calling so soon after a loss. Then he said there was a matter regarding the farm that he needed to discuss with her in person at her earliest convenience. And something in the specific formality of at your earliest convenience told Elaine, in the part of herself that had been reading between lines for 41 years, that what he wanted to discuss was not a small matter. She said she could come in on Monday. She hung up. She sat with her coffee for a long time. She did not know yet about the second mortgage. She did not know yet that Ray had been carrying a secret for 18 months, carrying it through planting season and harvest season and Christmas and her 63rd birthday and their 41st anniversary dinner, through every ordinary evening at this table and every Sunday morning at church, and every night he slept beside her in the dark, carrying it and saying nothing, because he believed he could fix it before she needed to know. She would learn all of that on Monday. This story is for anyone who has ever been left with a question they can never get an answer to. It is for anyone who has had to decide whether to forgive someone who is no longer there to explain themselves. Comment below if you've ever found out the truth too late. Stay with me, because this is not just a story about a farm. It is a story about a woman, 2 children, and what a secret does to a family after the person who kept it is gone. The Hargrove farm sat in the river bottom land of western Arkansas, in a crease of the Arkansas River Valley between Fort Smith and Van Buren, where the land went flat and dark and fertile between the Ozark ridgelines to the north and east. Ray Hargrove's grandfather had cleared the first 30 acres of it in 1931, during the Depression, with a borrowed mule and a conviction that a man who owned his ground owned his future. By the time Ray's father took it over in the early 1960s, the farm had grown to just over 100 acres. By the time Ray inherited it in 1987, it was 220 acres, a functional mixed operation, mostly soybeans with some winter wheat, a small row of bottomland that grew corn in wet years and didn't in dry ones, and a modest cattle operation on the back pasture that never made real money, but that Ray kept because his father had kept it, and because he believed that a farm without animals wasn't fully a farm. Ray Hargrove was not a complicated man. He was disciplined, early rising, quiet in the specific way of men who believe that the work speaks for itself. He went to church at Calvary Baptist in Van Buren, not because he was devout in a vocal sense, but because it was the right thing to do, and he was in most matters the kind of man who did the right thing and didn't make a speech about it. He was not good at talking about money. He was not good at talking about fear. He was very good at being in a field at 5:30 in the morning and knowing exactly what the day needed from him. Elaine Dunbar had met Ray at a county fair in 1980, married him in 1982, and had never once in 41 years of marriage wished she had married someone less stubborn. She had wished many times that he would talk more about money, about worry, about the things that kept him awake in the years when the market was bad or the weather was wrong. She had never been able to get those conversations out of him in any complete form. He answered questions minimally and deflected the rest. It was the one wall in their marriage that she had never found a way through, and she had eventually made a kind of peace with it. Not because the wall didn't bother her, but because every other part of Ray Hargrove was worth the wall. They had 2 children. Carl was born in 1983. He was the one who stayed. He had worked beside his father from the time he was old enough to be useful on a tractor, and had never seriously entertained the idea of a different life. After high school, he took some agriculture courses at the community college in Fort Smith, but came home after a year because the farm needed him, and because, though he would not have put it this way, the farm was already his identity and college was someone else's idea of what a life could be. He was built like Ray, worked like Ray, and had his father's jaw and his father's way of going silent when the conversation moved into territory he didn't know how to navigate. He and Ray had farmed together for 20 years without ever having a sustained conversation about money, which was not a coincidence. It was an inheritance, the same silence passed from one generation to the next without anyone deciding to pass it. Diane was born in 1986. She was the one who left. Not because she didn't love the farm. She did, in the distant way you love something that shaped your childhood but cannot hold your adulthood. She had gone to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, stayed in Fayetteville for 5 years working in marketing, then followed her husband Kevin to Memphis when his company transferred him in 2014. She had 2 kids, a mortgage on a house in Germantown, and a life that had no room for soybeans. She called Elaine every week. She came home for Thanksgiving and most Christmases. She loved her mother with an easy consistency that made the distance between them feel smaller than it was. The farm ran on a rhythm that had not changed much in 3 generations. Up before light, breakfast. The fields, dinner at noon. A real dinner, a hot meal, the habit of farm-wise maintained. Back to the fields. Supper at 6. Church on Sundays. The Bible on the kitchen windowsill. Elaine's, given to her by her own mother, read more consistently than Ray's, but held by both of them as a kind of household anchor. In the early years, the farm had been tight, but manageable. Commodity prices cycled. Input costs crept upward. Ray refinanced the original land note once, in 2004, when a drought year made the operating balance impossible without restructuring. He caught up in 2 good years and considered closed. He did not mention it to Elaine until it was over, because by the time he told her there was nothing to do about it, which was how Ray preferred to deliver difficult information, as history rather than as crisis. Elaine had noted that, had filed it, had not pushed through the wall. The 2010s were harder than the 2000s had been, and the 2020s harder still. Input costs, fertilizer, fuel, chemicals, had risen in ways that the soybean price had not reliably followed. Carl had expanded the operation slightly in 2019, leasing an additional 60 acres from a neighbor who had scaled back, which brought the total farm ground to 280 acres and increased the operating overhead without a guaranteed matching increase in income. Ray had agreed to the lease because it was good ground and because Carl wanted it, and because Ray Hargrove, at 65, was not willing to tell his son that the farm might already be stretched past what a second expansion could safely absorb. That was the year the margins started getting thin in ways that Ray began to manage privately. That was the year the wall between Ray and Elaine began, for the first time, to carry real weight behind it. The 2021 growing season was the worst the Hargrove farm had seen in 30 years. A late spring, cold and wet through most of April and into the second week of May, delayed planting by nearly 3 weeks. When they finally got the beans in the ground, a dry July followed. Not catastrophic drought, but the persistent, draining kind of dry that doesn't wipe a crop out, but holds it just below what it needs to be. The final yield was 61% of their 5-year average. The wheat acreage had fared better, but not enough to compensate. When Ray ran the final numbers in October of 2021, the operation had lost money. Not marginally, but substantially. Around $140,000 below break even after the operating loan payment. He did not tell Elaine. He told her the year had been rough. She knew that. She could see it in everything around her, in the yield numbers posted at the elevator, in the conversations at church about how other operations had struggled. She asked him specifically how far short they were. He said they were fine, that he had it handled, that there was a plan. There was not yet a plan. He spent the winter of 2021 into 2022 looking for one, calling his banker, reviewing refinance options, calculating what a good 2022 season would need to look like to pull the operation back to serviceable. He told Carl the books were tight, but manageable. He told Elaine the books were fine. He told himself he would fix it before anyone needed to know. 2022 was better. Not good, better. Commodity prices rose some. The yield was closer to average, but the operating deficit from 2021 had been carried forward. Quietly, in an unofficial way that Ray had funded by drawing down the small savings account he and Elaine maintained for emergencies. A $47,000 account they had built over 20 years for medical costs, equipment failure, the things that come without warning on a farm. By the end of 2022, the savings account had $9,000 in it. Elaine did not check that account regularly. She trusted Ray to manage it. In January of 2023, Ray went to First Heritage Bank alone. He met with the agricultural loan officer, a man named Dennis Archer, and laid out his situation with the flat precision of a man who has been calculating for months and has arrived at one conclusion. He needed to borrow against the equity in the farm to cover the accumulated operating deficit and fund the 2023 planting season, or the operation would not be able to plant. The farm had substantial equity. The land had appreciated. The original note was mostly paid down, but borrowing against it meant a second mortgage, and a second mortgage meant a payment structure he would need to carry in addition to the first. Archer laid out the terms. Ray signed. He signed for $185,000 at a fixed rate, a 5-year balloon, monthly payments of just over $2,100. He told himself he would have the debt meaningfully reduced within 2 seasons if the yields came back and the prices held. He drove home. He did not tell Elaine. He began making the monthly payment from the farm operating account, a line item that blended into the operating costs in a way that would not immediately surface to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. Carl, who did not have full visibility into the financial accounts, did not notice. Elaine did not manage the farm accounts. Ray managed the farm accounts. He had always managed the farm accounts. The wall between them had not grown taller. There was simply now something much heavier on the other side of it. Through the spring and summer of 2023, Ray worked the farm with the same physical presence and early morning discipline he had always brought to it. He fixed fence. He watched the sky. He sat at the dinner table and talked about the crop and the weather and Carl's plans for the back pasture, and nothing that was actually true about what he was carrying. At church on Sundays, he sat in his usual pew and bowed his head during the prayer in the way he always had, the posture of a man maintaining his relationship with God through the mechanics of reverence, even when the interior conversation had gone complicated. Elaine watched him that year the way she had learned to watch him over 41 years, not with suspicion, but with the readiness of a woman who knows that the man she loves does not always tell her when something is wrong, and who has learned to detect the particular quality of silence that means something is. She detected it. She did not push through the wall. The 2023 season was decent. The 2024 planting went in on schedule. Ray's plan, if the math had cooperated, might have worked. He might have reduced the second mortgage principal meaningfully over 2 good seasons and then, eventually, told Elaine what he had done when it was already mostly managed. That was the plan. Not malice, not contempt for his wife's intelligence or capability. Just the ironclad conviction of a man who had been solving his own problems alone since he was old enough to have them, who took the idea of protection, even protection that hadn't been asked for, as seriously as he took anything. In September of 2024, Ray Hargrove had a heart attack in the South Field while checking on the soybean crop. Carl found him. He was 67 years old. He had not told anybody about the second mortgage. He had made 11 monthly payments on it. He had $174,000 remaining on the note. He died believing he still had time to fix it. He did not have time. The funeral was at Calvary Baptist in Van Buren on a Friday in September. The church was full. Ray Hargrove had been in this valley his whole life. And in this community, 40 years of a man's consistent presence accumulates into a crowd on the day he is buried. The neighboring farmers, the gin operators, the elevator men, the feed store people, the church members who had sat in queues near his for decades, the county extension agent who had always liked Ray, the older women who brought food to the house beginning the morning after and kept bringing it for 2 weeks. Elaine received all of it with the controlled grace of a woman who was experiencing a grief so large and specific that the only way to move through its first days was to be completely present to everyone else's smaller version of it. She shook hands. She accepted casseroles. She thanked people for coming. She sat in the front pew of Calvary Baptist with Carl on her left and Diane on her right and listened to Pastor Warren speak about Ray Hargrove as a faithful man, a hard worker, a husband of 41 years, a man who showed his love through what he built rather than what he said. That phrase, showed his love through what he built, went through Elaine like something with an edge. She held it. She did not let it show. After the burial, after the food, after the last car left the driveway, and Carl had gone to check on the cattle, and Diane was in the kitchen doing dishes with the economy of a woman who processes hard things through her hands. Elaine sat in the living room alone and did something she had not done in years in quite this specific way. She prayed. Not the structured prayer of Sunday morning or the brief Thanksgiving before a meal. She prayed the way people pray when the language has run out. Without sentences, without requests, without the organized asking that assumes the asker knows what they need. She sat in Ray's chair, the one he had always sat in, and she held his absence in the room around her, and she said to God only the things that were absolutely true right then, which were, asterisk, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to be here without him. I am not even sure what I'm feeling is grief, because some of it feels like anger, and I don't know if I'm allowed to be angry at a man I just buried. Asterisk. She did not say any of that aloud. She sat in his chair. She stayed with it. The next morning, Pastor Warren came by the house to check on her. A kind man, genuinely well-meaning, who sat at the kitchen table with coffee and told Elaine that Ray was in a better place, and that God's timing was perfect, and that everything happened for a reason. And Elaine nodded and thanked him and watched him speak and felt, beneath her composed exterior, the specific loneliness of a grieving person being handed comfort that fits someone else's grief better than her own. God's timing. Everything for a reason. She believed in God. She had her whole life. But no arrangement of theological words in that moment reached the actual place she was in, which was a kitchen table, a dead husband, and a church coat still hanging on the back of the bedroom door. She thanked Pastor Warren for coming. She washed both coffee cups after he left. She picked up the Bible from the windowsill and held it without opening it. The the same way she had held it many times over 41 years. In the difficult moments, in the slow overnight emergency, when Carl had nearly lost 2 fingers in the PTO shaft, in the year the farm lost money and Ray wouldn't talk about it, in every hard season that had required her to stand in her own faith without the luxury of being held by another person. She was good at standing in it. She was not sure this was what she had been building that capacity for. On the Monday morning 3 weeks after the funeral, Elaine Hargrove drove herself to First Heritage Bank in Fort Smith. She had not told Carl about the call. Not yet. She told herself it was because she didn't want to worry him without knowing what the meeting was actually about. The truer reason was that she needed to know what she was dealing with before she handed it to anyone else, needed to understand the shape of the thing before she had to explain it. Dennis Archer met her in his corner office. He was in his late 40s, a careful man, and he had clearly spent time before this meeting deciding how to begin it. He said he was sorry for her loss. He said that Ray had been a good customer of the bank for many years. He said he hoped she was holding up. Then he opened a file. He showed her the second mortgage documents, the original signed note from January of 2023, the payment history showing 11 payments received, the current principal balance. He laid them in front of her with the practiced gentleness of a man delivering something hard to someone who has not yet braced for it. Elaine looked at the documents. She looked at Ray's signature on the original note. She said, "He never mentioned this to me." Archer said he understood. He said he was sorry. He said the bank had been willing to wait 3 weeks before contacting her because of the circumstances, but that the note carried a due-on-death clause, a standard provision in agricultural second mortgages, that technically made the full remaining balance callable upon the primary borrower's death. The remaining balance was $174,000. Elaine looked at the number. She asked if the first mortgage was current. It was, Archer said. Ray had kept the first mortgage current throughout. She asked what her options were. Archer explained them with the clean, patient thoroughness of someone who had done this many times. Option 1. Refinance the second mortgage into a new note in her name, assuming she could demonstrate sufficient income and asset coverage, which, given the farm's existing debt load and her income situation, would be difficult but potentially possible. Option 2. Sell enough land to retire the second mortgage principal, a portion of the acreage that would bring the balance payable. Option 3. List the full property for sale, pay both mortgages from the proceeds, and retain whatever equity remained. Option 4. Do nothing and allow the bank to initiate foreclosure proceedings, which would result in auction. She asked how long she had to decide. Archer said 60 days was the standard remediation window, though the bank would work with her if she needed slightly more time, given the circumstances. He said he was sorry again. He meant it. She could tell he meant it, which did not make the number on the table any smaller. She drove home. She did not go back to bed. She sat at the kitchen table, and she pulled out a legal pad from the drawer, where Ray had always kept legal pads, and she wrote down the numbers the way she had always written things down when she needed to think them through methodically. Column by column, the way her mother had taught her to manage a household budget, and the way she had maintained her own quiet parallel accounting of the farm's health for 41 years, even though Ray managed the accounts, even though she had never pushed him on what the numbers meant when they went quiet. The equity in the farm was real. The land was worth considerably more than either mortgage. But equity does not pay a callable note. Equity is theoretical until it is liquidated. She did the math 3 different ways. The math came out the same 3 different ways. Then she picked up the phone and called Carl. Carl came to the house that afternoon. He sat across the kitchen table from his mother with the documents between them, and he read through them with the concentrated deliberateness of a man who is refusing to react until he has all the information, and then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he said, "Why didn't he tell us?" It was not a question. It had the weight of a statement that is also an accusation and also a grief, all three at once, directed at a man who was no longer present to receive any of it. Elaine said she didn't know. Carl said, he was going to fix it. That's why. He said it with the certainty of a son who recognized his father's logic, because it was the same logic he himself carried. The iron conviction that a man handles his own problems before he lets them become someone else's problems. He said it, and then he heard himself say it, and the conflict in his face was the conflict of a man who is defending a decision he fundamentally disagrees with because the person who made it was his father, and his father is dead, and Carl does not know how to be angry at a dead man he loved. He said, "We can fix this." He said he would refinance. He said he would sell the cattle, all of them, and put that against the second mortgage principal. He said he would call the Farm Credit Office in Little Rock. He knew people there. He said he would work double hours. He would find a way to reduce the operating costs. They could reduce the leased acreage if necessary. He said, "We're not losing this farm. That is not happening." Elaine listened. She called Diane that evening. Diane drove up from Memphis the following Friday, a 5-hour drive she made after dropping her kids with Kevin's mother, and sat at the same kitchen table and read the same documents and had a different reaction. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked Elaine, carefully, "What does the equity look like if we sell?" Elaine showed her the numbers. After both mortgages, closing costs, and selling expenses, the remaining equity was somewhere between $80,000 and $110,000, depending on what comparable sales brought. Split 3 ways, between Elaine and the 2 children per Ray's estate structure. It was not a life-changing amount, but it was real. It was liquid. It did not require a refinance that might not be approved or a grueling attempt to service a $174,000 second mortgage on an operation that had already been losing money for 3 years. Diane said, carefully and with evident effort to be gentle about it, "Mom, fighting for this farm is going to take everything you have for the next several years, and at the end of it you might lose anyway. I don't think that's what Dad would want for you, Carl, who had come for dinner and was in the doorway, heard that. He said, "Don't tell me what Dad would want." Diane said she wasn't. He said, "You want to sell his farm 2 months after we buried him." She said, "I want our mother to have her life back." He said, "This farm is her life." Diane said, "No. This farm was Dad's life. Mama's a life too, The kitchen went very still. That sentence, "Mom has a life too," landed somewhere deep in all 3 of them at different angles. For Carl, it felt like his sister removing something he'd built his entire existence around. For Elaine, it felt like being seen by her daughter in a way that cost her something to be seen. For Diane, it was the truest thing she had said in weeks, and she felt the cost of saying it in the silence that followed it. Carl left the kitchen. He came back in an hour when he had walked around the perimeter of the farm twice, which was his father's exact method for cooling down, which he didn't realize he had inherited. The argument continued over the following weeks in the way family arguments over land continue. Not in clean, decisive confrontations, but in phone calls that ended badly, in texts that landed wrong, in Elaine being called by Carl 3 times a week with updates on refinancing attempts, and by Diane twice a week with careful, loving suggestions that selling was the right thing. Elaine held her phone and listened to each of her children and tried to remember that they were both coming from love, and tried not to show either of them how much the position between them was costing her. She called Diane one night in early December and asked her, "Did you know? When you were growing up, did you think something like this might happen? Diane Diane said she knew the farm was always tight. She said she didn't know it was this tight. Elaine said, I didn't either. There was a pause. Diane said, Are you angry at him, Mom? Elaine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm working on not being. That was the most honest thing she said to either of her children in that entire period. Carl's refinancing attempts lasted 6 weeks. He contacted Farm Credit, 3 regional agricultural lenders, a private equity firm that worked with distressed farm operations, and a credit union in Little Rock the neighboring farmer had used successfully 3 years earlier. All of them reviewed the same picture. A 280-acre operation with an existing first mortgage, a $174,000 second mortgage now in the widow's name, 3 consecutive years of marginal to negative operating cash flow, and a primary income earner, Carl, whose farming income alone did not meet the debt service coverage ratios those institutions required. 3 said no immediately. 2 took 2 weeks before saying no. The Farm Credit Office suggested a partial land sale, selling 70 acres of the least adjacent ground they had acquired in 2019, enough to retire the second mortgage, and restructuring the first mortgage with the remaining acreage. The math worked on paper. The problem was that 70 acres of that ground was the south bottom field, the best ground on the farm, the ground Ray had specifically valued most. Selling it would reduce the farm's income potential by 30% and leave Carl operating 210 acres with the same cost structure and less productive capacity. Carl rejected it. He drove to the house and told Elaine they should reject it. He said it was the same as selling. You lose the best ground and what you're left with doesn't support itself. Elaine listened. She said she needed to think. She had already been thinking. She had been thinking since Monday morning in Dennis Archer's office, thinking through it the way she thought through hard things, slowly, privately, in the early morning hours before the house was fully awake with her coffee and her Bible open on the table, even when she wasn't reading it, the way a woman keeps a thing close when she needs to remember what she believes. She had prayed for clarity. She was not sure clarity had arrived exactly, but something had, not an answer. More like an acceptance, the slow, quiet recognition of thing that is true whether you accept it or not, and that becoming ready to accept it is not surrender, but a different kind of courage. She had also been praying about Ray. She was still angry at him. She had decided she was allowed to be. He had made a decision. The second mortgage, the silence, the plan to fix it alone before she ever needed to know, that had taken a choice away from her. Had she known, in January of 2023, that he was going to a bank to borrow $185,000 against their farm without telling her, she would have had something to say. She would have had questions. She would have pushed through the wall that time because the stakes required it. Ray had known that, and he had gone to the bank anyway, alone. She could not ask him why. She had tried, in the quiet of the early mornings, to understand it without being able to ask. He was not a cruel man. He was not a deceptive man in the ordinary sense. He was a man who had learned somewhere deep in his formation that a man who cannot solve his own problems alone is somehow less capable, less worthy, less what he was supposed to be. That was not a lesson anyone had sat him down to teach him. It was something the valley had given him, something farming culture had given him, something his own father had given him without meaning to, the same way Carl had received it from Ray without meaning to pass it on. She understood it. She did not completely forgive it, but she understood it. On a Sunday morning in early January, she went to church at Calvary Baptist alone. Carl had offered to come. She told him she needed to go by herself. She sat in the pew that had been Ray's pew for 30 years, not the Hargrove family pew, just the pew he had always drifted to, third row from the back on the left, the one with the slight draft from the side door that never fully sealed. She sat there and she prayed and she let herself be in the building for an hour, and she did not feel miraculously better at the end of the hour. She felt steadied. That was enough. She called Dennis Archer on Monday morning and told him there would not be refinancing. She called Carl and told him. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Mom." She said, "I know, Carl." He said, "There has to be another way." She said, "Asterisk, I've been looking for 6 weeks. So have you. The 60 days are almost up. Asterisk." He said, "Give me more time." She said, "Baby, we don't have more time." He did not argue further. He had done the math too. He knew the math. He had known the math for 2 weeks and had been working against it out of something that was not optimism, but was the refusal to let his father's farm go without a fight, which felt, to Carl, like the last loyalty he could offer a man who didn't get to tell him goodbye. She listed the farm in early February. The listing did not produce a private sale within the bank's window. There was interest, one couple who walked the property twice and then did not make an offer, one corporate agricultural entity whose representative came out and assessed the ground and submitted an offer so far below market value that Elaine's attorney told her to decline it without a counter. The 60-day window expired without a viable transaction, and First Heritage Bank initiated foreclosure proceedings in mid-February. The auction was set for April 4th. The weeks between the foreclosure filing and the auction were the hardest weeks of the entire ordeal, harder, in some ways, than the weeks immediately following Ray's death, because at least in those weeks the grief had a clear object. These weeks had a different quality, the slow, bureaucratic countdown of a thing you have accepted but have not finished losing. Elaine continued to live in the farmhouse. Carl continued to work the farm. There were cattle to feed, the winter wheat to tend, the machinery to maintain, even though the farm now technically belonged to the bank in a foreclosure sense, and everything on it was scheduled to be liquidated. Carl fed the cattle every morning with the same care he had always given them. He did not talk about it much. He and Diane had reached a surface-level truce. The argument had not resolved exactly, but they had both exhausted themselves on it and had pulled back to a kind of careful mutual courtesy that was not warmth, but was also not war. Diane called Elaine. She did not call Carl. Carl did not call Diane. Elaine acted as the channel between them, which was not a role she had asked for and was not a sustainable one, and she knew it. She cleaned the farmhouse the week before the auction. Not packed, cleaned. She washed the windows. She cleaned the kitchen the way she cleaned it before company came. She could not explain why this seemed important except that the house had been kept a certain way for 41 years, and she was not going to let it meet strangers in any other condition. She took the Bible from the kitchen windowsill and put it in a box with a few other things: the family photographs, her mother's recipe box, her wedding china, that she would take with her to the small rental house she had arranged in Van Buren. She took the Bible first. The auction morning was cold and clear, a sharp April morning in western Arkansas, the sky a flat, washed blue, the river valley fields pale and still in the early light. Carl had driven out and was standing near the barn when the auction company arrived to set up. Elaine had told him she wasn't coming. She changed her mind at 7:30 and drove out. Diane had driven up from Memphis the night before. The three of them stood together near Carl's truck at the edge of the property, not in the auction crowd, which was gathering between the barn and the house, but at the perimeter, the way certain things are witnessed from a distance because you cannot afford to be inside them. The auction started at 9. The equipment went first. The tractor, a newer model than what Dale Merritt had lost, but machine Carl had operated for 11 seasons, sold to a man from Clarksville for $38,000. The cattle went through an on-site ring. The farm implements, the shop tools, each lot called, bid, sold, moved on. Carl watched without speaking. Elaine stood between her two children. At some point in the middle of the morning, she couldn't have said exactly when, Diane took her mother's hand, and Carl, who was standing on Elaine's other side with his arms crossed in the way he always stood when he was holding something difficult inside a controlled exterior, felt his sister's hand find his arm. He did not pull away. The land sold in 2 parcels. The river bottom ground, the south field, the best 80 acres of the farm, went to a large operation out of Sebastian County for $6,200 per acre. The remaining parcels went to 3 different buyers. The numbers were good by market standards. They were not enough, after both mortgages, to leave Elaine with what comfort is worth. But they were real, and they were over, and the farm was done being sold by 11:15. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the property for a long time after the last buyer drove out. Carl looked at the barn, the big barn his grandfather had built in 1962, a structure so solid it would outlast anyone who remembered why it was built. And he did not say anything for a long time. Then he turned to Diane. He said, "I'm sorry I was so hard on you." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Asterisk, you were trying to save it. I know that. Asterisk." He said, "Asterisk, so were you. You just didn't think it could be saved. Asterisk." She said, "I didn't think it was worth what saving it would cost, Mom." He absorbed that. He nodded. It was not a clean piece, the kind of thing that cinches in a moment and holds. It was the beginning of something. 2 people standing in the cold remains of their family's farm deciding, together, that they were not going to let this take each other too. It would take time to get back from where the last 4 months had put them. The argument had done real damage. Families do not walk back from that kind of pressure without work. But they were standing together. That was something. Elaine looked out at the valley, at the river bottom fields, at the Ozark ridgeline to the north, at the sky above it all. Enormous and indifferent and beautiful the way western Arkansas sky is always beautiful. And she felt something she had not expected to feel on this morning. Not relief, not peace, not the arrival of an answer, just the strange, quiet fact of still being here. Elaine Hargrove moved into a small rental house on a maple-lined street in Van Buren in the 2nd week of April. It had 2 bedrooms, a small yard, a kitchen with windows that looked out at a neighbor's garden rather than at fields. She had lived with a view of fields for 41 years. The first mornings in the new house, she stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and found herself looking at tomato cages and a bird feeder and felt, each time, the particular dislocation of a woman whose landmarks have been removed and who must now learn to read a different sky. She managed it. She was good at managing things. Carl did not leave the farm valley immediately. He stayed through May, working in neighbor's operation for wages. The same kind of rearrangement that farm families in hard season have always made, dignity requiring that the skills continue to be used even when the ground that received them has changed ownership. He found a farm management position through a contact at the extension office in August, a larger operation near Greenwood that needed someone with his experience, a job that used everything he knew, that got him into a field at 5:30 in the morning and kept him useful and moving. He drove past the Hargrove farm one time after the sale. He did not slow down. He and Diane called each other for the first time in 4 months on the Sunday after Mother's Day. The call was short, 20 minutes, functional, careful. What happened? That was Carl's way of extending something without making a speech about it, which Diane understood because she had grown up with it, because it was his father's way too. They called each other again 2 weeks later. And the week after that, Elaine planted a small garden in the yard of the rental house in late April. Tomatoes, squash, a row of green beans, because she had always grown a garden and because the body remembers what it is supposed to do in spring even when everything else has changed around it. She tended it in the early mornings with the same attention she had given 40 years of farm dawns. She kept Ray's photograph on the mantle of the rental house. She kept the Bible on her nightstand. She still prayed in the same quiet way she had always prayed. Not performing, not asking for things, mostly just keeping the conversation open with someone she trusted even when the answers were not what she had wanted and the timing was not anything she would have chosen. She had forgiven Ray. Not in the dramatic, declarative way of someone who has finished with a feeling. In the slow, ongoing way of someone who chooses, on most days, not to live inside the anger. There were still mornings when she thought about the signed document in Archer's folder. Ray's signature on the second mortgage. January 2023, the month she had thought was just a cold, ordinary February. And something hard moved through her. She let it move through. She did not build a room around it. What she held on to, in the end, was what she actually knew to be true about Ray Hargrove, that he had gotten up before dawn every morning for 40 years to care for a piece of ground that his grandfather had cleared with a borrowed mule, that he had kept the cattle through the losses because his father had kept cattle, that he had loved his family in the way of a man who shows love through what he builds and what he tends and what he refuses to let fall. And that when, at the end, something was falling that he could not hold, he had chosen silence over admission because silence was the only dignity he knew how to offer himself. She did not excuse it. She understood it. That understanding was not the same as peace. But it sat beside peace. It sat in the same room. Her daughter called every week. Her son called increasingly. On a Sunday afternoon in July, Diane drove up from Memphis with the grandchildren, and they had lunch in Elaine's small kitchen. Too many people for the space. Chairs borrowed from the bedroom. The table crowded with food and noise, and the complicated warmth of a family that has been through something and is still there. Carl came too, and he and Diane sat at the same table for the first time since the auction and were, if not easy with each other, at least present, choosing presence over the distance that was easier. After lunch, after the grandchildren had moved to the yard, Carl and Diane stood at the kitchen window, together watching Elaine in the garden. Kneeling between the tomato rows, pulling weeds with the same focused, unhurried attention she brought to every task. And Diane said quietly, "She's going to be okay." Carl watched his mother's hands in the garden dirt. He said, asterisk, she was always going to be okay. She's tougher than either of us, asterisk. Diane said, asterisk, she got that from somewhere. It wasn't Dad, asterisk. Carl almost smiled. He said, asterisk, no. It was never Dad, asterisk. The farm in the river bottom was being worked by its new owners that summer. The south field planted in soybeans, the north ground in corn, the barn standing unchanged against the July sky. It was being worked well. The ground did not know the difference. The ground needed working, and it was being worked. The Hargrove name was still in it, in the soil compaction patterns that Ray's practices had created over 40 years, in the drainage tile he had laid in the lone northeast corner in 2009 that nobody had needed to replace, in the fence line that Carl had rest-strung in 2018 that was still holding. The land carried the history of the people who worked it even after those people were gone. It always does. Some of what a family leaves behind is visible and sellable and transferred at auction. Some of it is in the ground. Some of it is in a woman's garden on a maple-lined street in Van Buren, in the way she kneels between the rows with her hands in the dirt and does not need anyone to tell her what the season requires. Elaine Hargrove did not get to save her husband's farm. She did not get to ask him why he kept the secret. She did not get the answer she deserved to the question she had been waiting 41 years to push through the wall to ask. She got a document in a banker's folder, a number on a page, and 60 days to decide what to do with a life that had been arranged, without her knowledge, around a weight she had not been allowed to share. She forgave him anyway, not because faith required her to perform forgiveness on a schedule, because she knew Ray Hargrove, knew the whole man, not just the part that failed her, and she chose to let the whole man be more true than the last chapter. That is not a small thing. That is one of the hardest things a person can do. Her son kept farming. Her daughter called every week. The family is not what it was before Ray died. But then, families are never what they were before the hardest thing. They become what they are after. Sometimes after is smaller. Sometimes after is different in ways that turn out, slowly, to be sufficient. The Bible is on her nightstand. She opens it more than she used to. If you have ever had to forgive someone who wasn't there to receive it, leave a comment. If you've ever had to choose between fighting for something and protecting someone, I want to hear from you. If you've ever stood at an auction and watched something go that you built your whole life around, drop a word in the comments. This channel is for those stories. Yours matter too. The Hargroves held on to each other. After everything, that is what held.